The Blackthorn Cliff Lodge in Northern California offered a secluded and picturesque escape for honeymooners. Nestled among towering redwoods and perched on the edge of a dramatic coastline, the lodge boasted breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean and winding trails leading to hidden coves. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and pine, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below created a tranquil, almost hypnotic rhythm. It was the ideal setting for couples seeking romance and adventure. Far from the distractions of the modern world, Nick and Becca Hayes arrived at the lodge with the excitement of newlyweds embarking on the first chapter of their life together. Nick, a landscape architect from Portland, had always been drawn to nature and its serene beauty. Becca, an ambitious real estate agent from Phoenix, appreciated the luxury and exclusivity of the destination. Together, they seemed like a perfect match, balanced and complementary. Over the first 2 days, they explored the scenic trails, shared intimate dinners, and soaked in the peaceful atmosphere of their private cabin overlooking the cliffs. Yet, beneath the surface of their idyllic honeymoon, subtle tension simmered. Nick, known for his quiet thoughtfulness, appeared increasingly distracted as the days went by. He spent more time observing the horizon than engaging in conversation, his mind clearly preoccupied. Becca, on the other hand, maintained her lively demeanor, brushing off any sign of unease with a bright smile. To the staff and other guests, they appeared happy and in love, but there was an unspoken undercurrent of unease between them. On the third evening, Nick and Becca dined at the lodge's cliffside restaurant. The setting was perfect. The glow of candlelight reflected in the panoramic windows, and the sound of the ocean below added a sense of tranquility. Yet, the mood between them was subdued. Nick seemed introspective, his focus on his untouched plate, rather than the vibrant energy of his wife. Becca filled the silence with talk of plans for the next day, but Nick's responses were brief and distant. That night, everything changed. At 2:30 a.m., the stillness of the lodge was shattered by a frantic call to the front desk. Becca Hayes reported her husband missing. She described how they had been hiking along the cliffs under the stars when Nick slipped and fell into the ocean. Her voice, trembling with fear and desperation, urged the staff to act quickly. Within minutes, the lodge's security team and local authorities were mobilized, flashlights cutting through the dense mist as searchers combed the rugged trails and rocky terrain. Becca was found sitting near the trailhead, wrapped in a blanket provided by the staff. Her face was pale, streaked with tears, and her hair hung in disarray. She recounted how Nick had lost his footing near the edge of the cliff while attempting to retrieve her scarf, which had been caught by the wind. The search team listened carefully, noting the details of her account before continuing their efforts. The cliffs surrounding the lodge were known for their danger, even during daylight. Steep drops, uneven paths, and unpredictable tides made them treacherous. The team scoured the area near the spot Becca indicated, but found no trace of Nick. The ocean below, churned by powerful currents, offered little hope of recovery. As the search progressed, unsettling discoveries began to surface. Bloodstains were found on the rocks near the edge of the cliff, raising questions about the nature of the accident. A bright red scarf, which Becca claimed had been blown away by the wind, was discovered tied to a branch several feet from the path. The placement of the scarf seemed deliberate, not the result of a gust of wind as described. By dawn, the scope of the search had expanded to include boats and drones scouring the coastline and surrounding waters. Despite their efforts, no sign of Nick was found. Becca remained at the lodge, her grief visible but measured. She answered questions when asked, her responses calm, yet tinged with sorrow. The lead investigator, Detective Caleb Renner, arrived at the scene shortly after sunrise. A seasoned professional, Renner approached the case with a meticulous eye, reviewing every detail provided by Becca and the search team. He examined the couple's cabin, where Nick's belongings remained untouched. His phone, wallet, and neatly folded clothes were still in place. The scene was tidy, almost unnaturally so. With no signs of disturbance or struggle, Renner's attention turned to the lodge's check-in records and surveillance footage. Becca had specifically requested the most secluded cabin during their reservation, citing a desire for privacy. Footage from earlier in the evening showed the couple walking hand in hand toward the trail, their silhouettes illuminated by the soft glow of the lodge's lanterns. Nick appeared relaxed, while Becca's movements seemed purposeful, almost hurried. As the search dragged on without results, Renner's instincts told him there was more to this case than a tragic accident. The bloodstains, the scarf, and the pristine condition of the couple's cabin raised unanswered questions. Becca's account, though emotionally convincing, left gaps that needed to be filled. Renner, his notebook in hand, prepared to delve deeper into the events of that fateful night, determined to uncover the truth. The search for Nick Hayes stretched into the late afternoon. Yet the rugged cliffs and the churning waters below refused to yield any answers. Inside the lodge, Becca remained seated in the common area, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Her tea sat untouched on the table. The steam long dissipated. Her demeanor projected sorrow, but her calm, measured responses to questions struck Detective Caleb Renner as calculated rather than raw. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. Renner began digging into the couple's lives to understand who Nick and Becca Hayes truly were. On the surface, they seemed like an ideal match. Nick, a respected landscape architect from Portland, was known for his passion for preserving nature and his meticulous approach to his craft. Those who knew him described him as thoughtful, steady, and kind. Yet beneath his calm exterior, there were hints of tension. In the days leading up to the wedding, Nick had confided in his younger sister Rachel about growing doubts. He didn't elaborate, but Rachel distinctly remembered his parting words before the honeymoon. "Sometimes people aren't who you think they are." Rachel's concerns deepened when Renner contacted her for information about Nick's state of mind. She revealed that Nick had started keeping a journal in the months leading up to the wedding, a habit he'd never had before. He'd mentioned that writing helped him process his feelings about the relationship. The journal, recovered from the couple's cabin, contained entries that suggested growing unease. One line stood out: "Her stories don't always add up. I need to address this before it's too late." Renner's initial impression of Becca, however, painted a very different picture. An ambitious real estate agent from Phoenix, Becca exuded charm and confidence. Her colleagues praised her ability to close deals with ease. But they also noted her reluctance to share personal details. Questions about her family or past relationships were often met with vague answers or deflections. On the surface, she appeared to be a self-made success story. Yet Renner's investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. Becca's financial records told a story of a woman in recovery. Before meeting Nick, she had been burdened by significant debts, including defaulted loans and a foreclosure on a previous property. Strangely, those debts were suddenly paid off within months of her engagement to Nick. This financial turnaround coincided with her entry into a high-profile relationship with a man of substantial means. Renner noted the timing with suspicion. Darker patterns began to emerge as Renner dug deeper into Becca's past. Becca had been involved in 2 previous relationships with wealthy men, both of whom had died under unusual circumstances. One, a tech entrepreneur in San Francisco, had fallen during a hiking trip in what was ruled an accidental death. The other, an oil executive in Houston, had drowned during a boating excursion. Both cases had been closed without much scrutiny at the time, but the similarities to Nick's disappearance were impossible to ignore. Adding to the suspicion, Becca had used aliases in her previous relationships, obscuring her identity in a way that now seemed deliberate. While Renner pursued the couple's backgrounds, the lodge's staff and guests offered valuable insights. A guest in a neighboring cabin reported hearing raised voices late at night, followed by the sound of a struggle and a loud crash. Although the details were vague, the tone was unmistakable, a heated argument that escalated into violence. Another witness, a lodge employee, recounted an encounter with Becca earlier that evening. She had asked specific questions about the trails leading to the cliffs, particularly those less frequented by other guests. The employee had found her curiosity odd, but dismissed it at the time. Renner returned to the couple's cabin to examine the journal Rachel had mentioned. The entries painted a picture of a man who was growing increasingly wary of his new wife. Nick described moments when Becca's explanations didn't align, her evasions, and the nagging feeling that something was amiss. The final entry, written just days before his disappearance, read, "I can't ignore the signs anymore. Tonight I'll bring it up, no matter how she reacts." The implications were chilling. If Nick had confronted Becca, had it led to the events that now consumed the investigation? Forensic analysis of the bloodstains found near the cliff's edge confirmed they matched Nick's DNA. What seemed like a tragic accident began to look more like foul play when forensic technicians discovered traces of chloroform on a cloth hidden in the couple's bathroom. The presence of chloroform raised alarming questions. It was a substance rarely encountered by accident, suggesting premeditation. Renner began connecting the dots. Becca's calculated behavior, her history of financially motivated relationships, and the physical evidence painted a damning picture. While she maintained the persona of a grieving wife, the facts told another story entirely. The journal's entries, the tied scarf, and the witnesses' testimonies pointed to a deliberate act, not a misstep on a moonlit hike. By the time the day ended, Renner's focus had shifted. The investigation was no longer about finding a missing person. It had become a search for the truth about what happened to Nick Hayes. and whether his disappearance was part of a pattern that had played out before. The clues suggested a chilling possibility. Nick's honeymoon had been planned not as the beginning of a life together, but as the final chapter of his own. The cliffs surrounding Blackthorn Cliff Lodge were perilous, even in the best of conditions. By night, the area became an ominous maze of sharp rocks and uneven paths. Wind howled relentlessly off the Pacific Ocean, creating an eerie backdrop that seemed to swallow every sound but the distant crash of waves below. To traverse the trails in darkness required desperation or a deliberate purpose. Detective Caleb Renner suspected the latter as he pieced together the events surrounding Nick Hayes' disappearance. The timeline of the night began to solidify, but troubling discrepancies emerged with each new discovery. Security footage from the lodge showed Nick and Becca leaving their cabin shortly after 10:30 p.m. They walked side by side toward the trailhead, their figures illuminated briefly by the camera's infrared light before disappearing into the shadows. To the untrained eye, the footage seemed ordinary. However, Renner noted how Nick's stride appeared hesitant compared to Becca's determined pace. That was the last time anyone saw Nick alive. By the time Becca made her call to the front desk at 2:30 a.m., she had been away from the cabin for nearly 4 hours. Her account suggested a sudden tragic accident, yet her delayed reaction raised immediate questions. If Nick had fallen as Becca claimed, why had she waited so long to seek help? Retracing their steps that night, Renner followed the trail, his flashlight cutting through the thick mist. The path was treacherous, even with visibility, narrow and riddled with jagged outcroppings of rock. The salty scent of the ocean mixed with the earthy dampness of moss-covered cliffs, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Renner stopped where the search team had discovered bloodstains earlier that morning. The stains were irregular, not indicative of a single impact, but rather of movement, a struggle. Nearby, a vibrant red scarf hung tied to a low-hanging branch, fluttering slightly in the wind. Becca had claimed the scarf had blown away, leading Nick to lose his footing in an attempt to retrieve it. Yet, the way it was tied to the branch suggested otherwise. It appeared deliberate, as if staged. While Renner analyzed the scene, forensic reports trickled in from the lab. The blood on the rocks was confirmed to be Nick's, but it contained traces of chloroform. This revelation shifted the narrative entirely. Chloroform wasn't a substance one encountered accidentally. It required planning. Its presence, combined with the irregularities in Becca's story, pointed to something far more calculated. Witness accounts further complicated Becca's version of events. Allison Harper, a guest staying in the cabin adjacent to Nick and Becca's, reported hearing raised voices around midnight. She described the exchange as heated, escalating into what sounded like a physical altercation before a loud crash silenced everything. Too afraid to investigate, Harper had dismissed the noise as a lover's quarrel, only realizing its significance the following morning. Another witness, Greg Mathers, a local fisherman, added to the growing puzzle. He had docked his boat near the cliffs that night and recalled seeing a lone figure dragging something heavy toward the cliff's edge around 1:30 a.m. The moonlight had offered only a faint silhouette, but the figure's actions stood out as odd. The couple's cabin revealed its own troubling details. Nick's belongings remained untouched, his wallet and clothes neatly arranged, as if he had planned to return. However, forensic analysis uncovered a critical clue. A cloth tucked into the bathroom cabinet contained traces of chloroform. This finding confirmed that whatever had happened to Nick wasn't spontaneous. Someone had prepared for this. Renner returned to Nick's journal, which he had found during an earlier search of the cabin. The entries became increasingly ominous. Nick expressed growing doubts about Becca, mentioning inconsistencies in her stories and unexplained behavior. His final entry, dated just days before the honeymoon, read, "I've been ignoring the signs for too long. There's something I'm not seeing. Tonight, I'll ask her." Renner now had a clearer picture of what might have transpired that night. The journal hinted that Nick had confronted Becca, perhaps on the very cliffs where he was last seen. Forensic evidence suggested he had been drugged with chloroform, incapacitated before the alleged fall. The scarf tied to the branch seemed more like a prop to support a fabricated story than the cause of a tragic accident. The timeline continued to tighten. Forensics placed the bloodstains on the rocks between midnight and 1 a.m., aligning with Harper's account of the argument. Mathers' sighting of the figure at 1:30 a.m. fit the sequence, and Becca's call at 2:30 a.m. now seemed less like an act of panic and more like a calculated alibi. When Renner interviewed Becca again, her responses remained consistent, but her delivery felt rehearsed. She repeated her story with practiced pauses, her voice catching at moments designed to elicit sympathy. Yet, when pressed about the gap in time between Nick's supposed fall and her call for help, she grew defensive, accusing Renner of being insensitive to her grief. Renner remained composed, silently cataloging her reactions. Each question and answer added another piece to the puzzle. Becca's calm demeanor and her precise, almost clinical recounting of events contrasted sharply with the chaotic scene described by witnesses and the physical evidence found at the cliffs. The scarf, the bloodstains, the chloroform, all pointed to a version of events vastly different from the one Becca insisted was true. As Renner stood at the cliff's edge later that evening, staring out at the turbulent sea below, he felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. Somewhere beneath the waves, Nick's body might still lie, carried away by the relentless currents. Yet Renner didn't need the body to see the truth. The evidence spoke loudly enough. Whatever had happened on those cliffs wasn't an accident. It was planned, deliberate, and sinister. Turning back toward the lodge, Renner knew the investigation was far from over. Becca Hayes had answers he needed, and she was running out of places to hide. Detective Caleb Renner's unease deepened as he reviewed the mounting evidence. The picturesque lodge, once a haven for honeymooners, now seemed like a stage for something dark and calculated. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident was unraveling into a web of deceit, manipulation, and premeditation. The question was no longer whether Nick Hayes had fallen. It was who had orchestrated the fall and why. Renner's instincts drew him back to the lodge's staff and guests, hoping to uncover details that had been overlooked. The resort manager, a meticulous man named Charles Everett, confirmed Becca's request for the most secluded cabin upon booking. She had insisted on privacy, a detail that seemed innocuous at first but now felt deliberate. Becca's behavior during her stay also raised questions. Staff recalled her asking specific questions about the cliffs, particularly about trails with minimal foot traffic. While such inquiries weren't unheard of, in hindsight, they felt oddly specific. Further interviews with the staff unearthed another troubling encounter. A housekeeper, Maria Torres, remembered an unusual interaction while cleaning the couple's cabin earlier in the week. Becca had asked her to skip the bathroom that day, claiming she would clean it herself. Maria found this odd, but had complied without question. Renner made a note to revisit the forensic analysis of the bathroom, where traces of chloroform had already been found. The neighboring guest, Allison Harper, provided more details during a second interview. The argument she overheard had grown louder before culminating in a loud crash. This time, she described a phrase she thought she heard. "You lied to me." It had been muffled but clear enough to recognize anger and betrayal in the tone. After the crash, there had been silence, followed by what sounded like footsteps retreating toward the lodge. Harper had assumed the argument had resolved itself but now regretted not checking on the noise. A clearer picture began to form in Renner's mind. The timeline pointed to a confrontation between Nick and Becca at the cliffs. The journal entries suggested Nick had been growing increasingly suspicious of his wife, and the phrase overheard by Harper implied a confrontation about dishonesty. The forensic evidence of chloroform hinted that whatever transpired wasn't spontaneous. Someone had planned for violence. The discovery of Greg Mathers, the fisherman's, statement added a chilling dimension. His description of a lone figure dragging something heavy toward the cliff's edge around 1:30 a.m. aligned perfectly with the timeline of events. Mathers admitted he had thought little of it at the time, assuming it was debris being discarded, but his account now carried weight. Renner cross-referenced Mathers' description of the figure's build and movements with Becca's, and while circumstantial, the resemblance was undeniable. Back at the forensics lab, the analysis of Nick's blood revealed something even more disturbing. In addition to the presence of chloroform, traces of a sedative were found, likely administered before the altercation. The sedative suggested that Nick had been incapacitated before being taken to the cliffs. The sequence of events pointed to a deliberate setup, drugging him to weaken his resistance, staging an argument to create a plausible explanation for any disturbance, and ensuring his fall appeared accidental. Renner returned to the cabin for a deeper investigation. The space felt sterile, almost too perfect for a couple on their honeymoon. Despite the presence of Nick's belongings, there was an absence of personal touches. No shared laughter and photographs. No scattered souvenirs from their days at the lodge. Renner focused on the bathroom, where Maria had been instructed not to clean. Hidden in the back of the cabinet beneath the sink, he found a small, empty bottle labeled with the pharmaceutical company's logo. The faint residue inside confirmed it was the source of the sedative. Renner sent the bottle to the lab for further analysis and examined the cabin's trash bin. Among crumpled receipts and packaging, a crumpled note caught his attention. The paper was torn, but a few words stood out. "You won't get away with it." The handwriting didn't match Becca's neat script. It matched the entries in Nick's journal. The note added a new layer of complexity. Had Nick left it as a warning, or had it been part of the confrontation that led to his disappearance? The more Renner uncovered, the more calculated Becca's actions appeared. Her financial history revealed additional red flags. Just weeks before the wedding, she had purchased a $2 million life insurance policy on Nick, citing it as a standard precaution for their future. The timing was suspect, aligning with her sudden clearance of significant debts. Digging deeper, Renner discovered similar patterns in her past. Two previous partners, both wealthy, had died under suspicious circumstances. One had fallen during a hiking trip. The other had drowned during a boating accident. Both deaths had been ruled accidents, and Becca had collected substantial payouts from their respective estates. Renner's growing theory was dark, but increasingly plausible. Becca had married Nick not for love, but for financial gain. Her charm and sophistication had masked a history of manipulation and calculated moves. When Nick began to suspect the truth, she realized she couldn't afford to let him expose her. The honeymoon at Blackthorn Cliff Lodge had been chosen not for its romance, but for its isolation and the opportunity it provided. The case was no longer a mystery to Renner. It was a puzzle of evidence, and each piece was falling into place. The argument overheard by Harper, the blood and sedative in Nick's system, the scarf tied deliberately as a prop, all pointed to Becca as the architect of Nick's disappearance. Yet, without a body, Renner knew he faced an uphill battle in proving his case. He needed more, a confession, a witness who could place Becca at the cliff's edge, or a breakthrough in the search for Nick. Renner stood at the lodge's edge, overlooking the vast expanse of ocean. The waves churned violently below, a stark reminder of how easy it would be for someone to disappear forever in the unforgiving depths. Somewhere beneath those waves, Nick's body might still lie, holding the final answers to a case already brimming with deceit. For now, Renner focused on the evidence in front of him, and the growing certainty that Becca Hayes was not a grieving widow, but a predator who had underestimated the strength of the trail she'd left behind. He turned away from the cliffs and headed back to the lodge. There was more work to be done, and Becca Hayes was running out of places to hide. The truth wasn't just closing in, it was about to confront her head-on. The mounting evidence against Becca Hayes left little room for doubt, and Detective Caleb Renner prepared for a confrontation. Her facade of grief and concern had been carefully maintained since Nick's disappearance, but cracks were beginning to show. Renner intended to use the discrepancies in her story to expose the truth, knowing that even the most seasoned liars faltered under pressure. Becca's behavior during the investigation had been controlled to the point of suspicion. She projected an image of a grieving wife, but her actions suggested calculation rather than shock. While most spouses in her position would be frantically engaged in the search or visibly distraught, Becca remained measured, retelling the same details with precision each time she was questioned. Renner planned to challenge her story with the inconsistencies that had surfaced, watching closely for any signs of collapse. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Becca sat poised, her appearance immaculate. Her carefully chosen attire suggested confidence, yet her tightly clasped hands betrayed an undercurrent of tension. Renner began by laying out the timeline of Nick's disappearance, emphasizing the significant gap between her account and the evidence. Becca claimed the incident occurred shortly after 10:30 p.m., yet she didn't call the front desk until 2:30 a.m. When pressed about the 4-hour delay, she insisted it was due to shock and uncertainty, a response that Renner noted was too rehearsed. Photographic evidence added further strain to her narrative. The red scarf, which she claimed Nick had been attempting to retrieve when he fell, had been found securely tied to a branch near the trail. Its placement contradicted her story, suggesting it had been deliberately staged rather than blown by the wind. Becca's explanation for this discrepancy was vague, citing distress and memory lapses. Her carefully maintained composure faltered momentarily, revealing the first signs of unease. Witness testimonies painted an increasingly troubling picture. A neighboring guest reported hearing a heated argument between the couple, culminating in a loud crash followed by silence. Another witness, a fisherman, described seeing a figure resembling Becca, dragging something heavy toward the cliff's edge in the early hours of the morning. Combined with forensic evidence, these accounts suggested a struggle rather than an accident. Forensic reports confirmed that the bloodstains found near the edge of the cliff matched Nick's DNA. The pattern of the stains indicated movement, consistent with a physical altercation. Additionally, traces of chloroform were discovered in the blood, pointing to the use of a sedative prior to the incident. The presence of a nearly empty bottle of sedative hidden in the couple's bathroom provided a damning link to Becca. Surveillance footage from a pharmacy near her residence showed a woman matching her description, purchasing the sedative under a false name just days before the honeymoon. Further examination of the couple's cabin revealed more inconsistencies. Nick's belongings were untouched, as though he had planned to return. Yet, hidden among discarded receipts and papers in the trash bin, investigators found a torn note. Its contents, written in Nick's handwriting, read, "You won't get away with it." This note added another layer to the case, hinting at a confrontation that likely led to Nick's disappearance. Becca's financial history also raised red flags. Shortly before the wedding, she had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on Nick, citing it as a precaution for their future. The timing coincided with the sudden resolution of significant debts she had accrued over the years. This discovery mirrored patterns from her past, where two previous wealthy partners had died under suspicious circumstances. Both deaths had been ruled accidents, allowing Becca to collect substantial financial benefits. By now, Renner had formed a clear theory of what had transpired. Becca had used her charm to ensnare Nick in a relationship, intending to exploit him financially. When Nick began to suspect her motives, she realized she needed to act before he exposed her. The isolated setting of the Blackthorn Cliff Lodge provided the perfect cover for a carefully orchestrated crime. Becca's reactions during questioning only reinforced Renner's suspicions. Her insistence on repeating the same polished story, combined with the evidence contradicting her account, suggested she was clinging to a fabricated version of events. When confronted with the timeline inconsistencies, the forensic findings, and the witness accounts, she shifted between defensiveness and feigned confusion. Her explanations grew weaker as the weight of the evidence bore down on her. The case against Becca was becoming airtight, yet Renner knew that without a body, a conviction would be challenging. The absence of Nick's remains left room for doubt, no matter how compelling the circumstantial evidence. Still, every new discovery further dismantled Becca's narrative, leaving her with fewer places to hide. Renner stepped out of the interrogation room, his mind racing with the pieces of the puzzle. The evidence pointed to a premeditated act, carried out with chilling precision. Becca's carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, and the truth was closing in. Somewhere beneath the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean lay the final answers to the case. Until they surfaced, Renner would continue to peel back the layers of deception, knowing that the truth was now within reach. As the sound of the waves echoed in the distance, Renner steeled himself for the next step. The investigation was far from over, but the mask Becca had so carefully worn was beginning to crack. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of her betrayal was revealed. The investigation had reached a turning point. Detective Caleb Renner knew that the walls were closing in on Becca Hayes. Yet he also understood the precariousness of his position. Without a body, the case remained circumstantial, and every piece of evidence, no matter how damning, could still be challenged. Becca had crafted her story carefully, leaning into her role as a grieving wife, and her rehearsed explanations, while flawed, still provided her with an edge. Renner needed something undeniable to break through her facade. The ocean, vast and unrelenting, remained a silent accomplice in the case. Somewhere beneath its turbulent surface, Renner believed, lay the answers he sought. Nick Hayes' body was the missing link that could cement the narrative and leave no room for doubt. The search teams had scoured the cliffs and surrounding waters for days, but the currents were unpredictable, capable of carrying evidence far from the scene of the crime. Renner reviewed the case file late into the night, combing through every detail. The scarf tied neatly to the branch, the bloodstains smeared across the rocks, the sedative-laced cloth hidden in the cabin, all painted a picture of premeditation. Yet, it was the timelines that continued to haunt him. If Becca had returned to the cabin over an hour before making the call to the front desk, what had she been doing during that time? The security footage showed her entering the cabin alone, her movements hurried and deliberate. But there was no footage of her leaving again until after her call for help. The morning brought a breakthrough. A local diver, part of a volunteer search team, discovered an object lodged in the rocks at the base of the cliffs. It was a waterproof hiking boot, caked in seaweed and sand, but unmistakably belonging to Nick Hayes. The discovery reignited the search effort, narrowing the focus to a stretch of water where debris and bodies were often caught in natural whirlpools before being swept away. The renewed search brought hope, but it also intensified the pressure on Becca. The boot, coupled with the forensic evidence already collected, placed Nick's final moments squarely on the cliffs. Renner had the boot analyzed, and traces of blood on its surface matched the DNA found on the rocks. The evidence was damning, but still incomplete. Renner was determined to close the gap. Becca's financial records yielded another revelation. A transfer of $50,000 had been made to an offshore account 3 weeks before the honeymoon. The account was linked to a name previously tied to one of her late partners. This connection raised the possibility that Becca had accomplices or had engaged in similar schemes before. Renner's theory that Nick's death was part of a larger pattern of calculated moves gained more traction. Becca was no novice to deceit. Her actions suggested meticulous planning and a willingness to use others as pawns in her schemes. Renner arranged a meeting with forensic psychologist Dr. Lillian Marks, hoping to better understand the psychological profile of someone capable of committing such a crime. Dr. Marks, after reviewing the case details, described Becca as exhibiting traits of a manipulative personality, someone who used charm to mask a self-serving agenda. Such individuals often sought control over their environment and the people within it, viewing relationships as transactional rather than emotional. This insight added depth to Renner's understanding of Becca's motives. Her sudden interest in Nick, her push for marriage, and the extravagant honeymoon at an isolated location were not romantic gestures. They were calculated moves designed to achieve a specific outcome. Becca's pattern of behavior suggested that Nick was merely the latest in a series of targets. As the search continued, Renner intensified his focus on the lodge's staff and guests, hoping to uncover overlooked details. A night porter, hesitant at first, came forward with an account that further implicated Becca. He recalled seeing her near the cliffs earlier on the day of Nick's disappearance, inspecting the area with what he described as an unusual level of interest. She had asked him about the best spots to view the sunset and whether certain trails were frequently used. At the time, he thought she was merely planning a romantic outing, but in hindsight, her questions seemed calculated. The pressure on Becca mounted as the evidence grew. Renner orchestrated a second search of the couple's cabin, this time with a forensic team equipped to detect chemical residues. Hidden beneath the floorboards in the bedroom, they found a small vial with traces of chloroform, its seal broken. The vial's discovery corroborated the earlier findings of the sedative in Nick's system and further demonstrated Becca's premeditation. As Renner pieced together the timeline, he revisited the torn note found in the trash bin. The handwriting was conclusively identified as Nick's, and forensic analysis revealed faint smudges of blood on the paper. The note, which read, "You won't get away with it," was likely written in the moments before the final confrontation. Renner imagined the scene. Nick, aware of Becca's intentions, attempting to call her bluff, only for the confrontation to spiral into violence. The psychological tension in the case mirrored the physical tension of the ocean below. Renner's team had identified a section of water where currents converged, creating a natural trap for debris. This was their best chance of recovering Nick's body, but the conditions were treacherous. Days of searching yielded no further breakthroughs, and the weight of uncertainty began to bear down on the investigation. Despite the growing pressure, Becca continued to maintain her innocence. She portrayed herself as the victim of a tragic accident, a woman being unfairly targeted by an overzealous detective. Yet her composure began to fray. Under Renner's relentless questioning, her answers grew more defensive, her carefully rehearsed demeanor giving way to frustration. Each new piece of evidence forced her into a tighter corner, and Renner knew it was only a matter of time before her mask slipped entirely. The discovery of Nick's boot, the vial of chloroform, and the offshore account painted a chilling picture. Becca's narrative of grief and innocence was collapsing, replaced by a portrait of a cold and calculating woman who saw her relationships as little more than opportunities. Renner's focus sharpened. He was no longer searching for the truth. It was already clear. What he needed now was the final, indisputable piece to close the case and ensure Becca faced justice. As the waves continued to pound against the cliffs, Renner stood on the edge, staring out at the expanse of water. Somewhere beneath the surface lay the final answers, waiting to be uncovered. He felt the weight of the case pressing down on him, but knew he couldn't stop now. The truth was closer than ever, and Renner was determined to bring it to light, no matter how deeply it was buried. The investigation into Nick Hayes' disappearance reached its climax as Detective Caleb Renner marshaled his team for one final push. Days of relentless work had brought them to the precipice of the truth. But without a body, Becca Hayes still had room to maneuver. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture, but it lacked the singular, undeniable proof that would seal the case. Renner, however, sensed the walls closing in on Becca. Her calculated composure was cracking under the weight of the investigation, her mask slipping with every new revelation. The discovery of Nick's boot had reinvigorated the search along the base of the cliffs. Divers scoured the treacherous waters with renewed urgency, focusing on a natural whirlpool that acted as a trap for debris. The currents were unpredictable, but after days of meticulous effort, the search yielded its grim reward. A diver emerged from the water clutching a torn piece of fabric that matched the shirt Nick had been wearing on the night he disappeared. Within hours, they recovered human remains caught among the rocks. The body, though battered by the ocean, was identifiable through dental records as Nick Hayes. The discovery was the turning point Renner had been waiting for. With Nick's body recovered, the forensic team worked swiftly to uncover the story it told. Injuries to his skull and ribcage suggested blunt force trauma before the fall, a finding inconsistent with Becca's claim that he had simply slipped while reaching for a scarf. Traces of the sedative were confirmed in his system, further corroborating the theory that he had been drugged and incapacitated before being pushed over the cliff. Armed with this definitive evidence, Renner prepared to arrest Becca. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, a lodge employee who had been hesitant to come forward. The employee revealed seeing Becca on the cliffside trail earlier that night, pacing back and forth as though waiting for someone. This new witness testimony, combined with the physical evidence, left no doubt. Renner was ready to act. The arrest unfolded in the lodge's grand lobby, its serene atmosphere shattered by the presence of uniformed officers. Becca, dressed impeccably as always, initially appeared unbothered as Renner approached. Her confidence wavered, however, as he read her rights and informed her of the charges. First-degree murder. Her carefully constructed mask finally cracked. Her protests were loud and indignant, but they carried a note of panic. The facade was gone, replaced by the raw desperation of a cornered predator. At the station, Renner confronted Becca with the full weight of the evidence. The timeline of events, the forensic findings, the financial records, and the witness testimony formed a chain of logic too strong to break. Becca initially maintained her innocence, claiming she was being framed. However, as Renner methodically dismantled each of her defenses, her demeanor shifted. The carefully rehearsed grief gave way to fury, then to silence. The most damning moment came when Renner presented the autopsy results. The injuries to Nick's body proved he had been struck before his fall, and the traces of sedative in his bloodstream showed he had been incapacitated. Becca's explanation of an accidental fall could no longer stand. Renner pushed her further, outlining her financial motives, her pattern of manipulating wealthy partners, and her attempts to cover her tracks. The pressure finally broke her. In a moment of rage, Becca lashed out, accusing Nick of trying to ruin her life. "He wasn't who everyone thought he was," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "He wanted to leave me. He said he'd expose everything. I had no choice." Her outburst was the closest thing to a confession Renner would get, but it was enough. The statement, combined with the overwhelming evidence, ensured a strong case for prosecution. Becca Hayes was charged with premeditated murder and remanded into custody without bail. The trial that followed captivated the nation. The story of a charming and ambitious woman who preyed on wealthy men, orchestrating their deaths to secure financial gain, was a narrative both chilling and compelling. Prosecutors painted Becca as a cold and calculating manipulator, while her defense team attempted to cast doubt on the evidence, suggesting that Nick's death was a tragic accident or even self-inflicted. The jury, however, was unconvinced. After 3 weeks of testimony, Becca was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, the impact of Nick's death rippled through the lives of those who had known him. His family, devastated but resolute, established a foundation in his name to support environmental conservation, honoring his passion for nature. The lodge, once a tranquil retreat, became infamous for the crime, struggling to recover its reputation. Detective Renner, though satisfied with the outcome, carried the weight of the case. Knowing the darkness he had uncovered would linger in his mind, Becca Hayes' story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how greed and deception could destroy lives. Her mask of charm and sophistication had hidden a predator, but the truth had prevailed. For Renner, it was a hard-fought victory, a testament to persistence and the pursuit of justice. As the waves continued to crash against the cliffs where it all began, the case of Nick Hayes' murder was finally closed, but its lessons would not be forgotten. The case of Nick Hayes' murder serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of greed, manipulation, and deceit. Beneath the surface of charm and sophistication, hidden motives can fester, leading to unimaginable consequences. It highlights the importance of vigilance in relationships and the dangers of ignoring red flags, no matter how subtle. For law enforcement, it underscores the necessity of persistence and meticulous investigation in uncovering the truth. Even when it is buried beneath layers of lies and misdirection, ultimately, the tragedy teaches that justice, though not always swift, can prevail when those seeking it refuse to give up. Nick's legacy, a life dedicated to passion and honesty, remains a powerful contrast to the darkness that sought to destroy it, reminding us of the enduring value of integrity and trust. The story has been edited to ensure personal privacy and security regarding names and locations. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe to see the latest and most thrilling family crime stories.